humanity had not yet named itself, lost in the mists of time. The world did not belong to us alone. In the depths of forests, in the shadows of mountains, and in the roar of rivers, an ancient fear dwelled. This is the story of an era when the hunter became the hunted, when even the strong feared a shadow. This is the silent narrative of Neanderthal clans struggling to survive in a world echoing with the footsteps of giants reaching toward the sky. The sun hung in the hazy sky above the valley like a pale disk. The cold, sharp air filled their lungs. Each breath reminded them of life's fragility. Before the cave, clan members slowly stirred to life with the day's first light. Fire was the only refuge that drove away the night's cold, and the faces gathered around it were illuminated by the dancing light of flames. Kale carefully chipped at the obsidian fragment in his hand. Each strike was measured, each blow a repetition of thousands of years of knowledge. The spearhead he was making was not merely a hunting tool, but also a symbol of the will that would protect his family and clan. His wife Alara spread the healing herbs she had gathered in a more secluded corner of the cave to dry, while their young son Lin had created his own small world among the bison and mammoth figures drawn in charcoal on the cave wall. Their lives existed in a cycle harmonious with nature's rhythm: hunting, gathering, making tools, and most importantly, surviving. This valley was their home. They knew every tree, every rock, every bed where water flowed. It was safe here, or at least they wanted to believe it was. But this peace was one that always required vigilance. Every unusual sound from the forest depths, every unexpected shadow appearing in the sky, would instantly bring that ancient anxiety in their hearts to the surface. Gore, the clan's eldest, had fixed his eyes on the dark area where the forest thickened. Though his eyes no longer saw as well as before, his experience gave him a sense beyond seeing. He could feel it. That unfamiliar weight in the air, that strange tension within the silence. This wasn't the presence of an ordinary hunter, a bear, or a saber-toothed tiger. This was something deeper, more fundamental. It was like that absolute silence that comes before the earth trembles. The valley's calm was actually like a thin sheet of ice, and no one knew exactly what lay beneath. There were only whispers, old stories, and warnings passed down from ancestors. No one wanted to talk about them, because fear that is named becomes more real. So for now they maintained their silence, continuing their daily tasks. Kale finished his spear. Alara arranged her herbs. Lin drew new companions for the animals on the wall. The crackling of the fire was the only melody mixing with the valley's silence. But in a corner of everyone's mind were the forest's watching eyes. They were aware of that fragile peace that could shatter at any moment. The hunting group advanced toward the forest depths at midday. Kale was at the front of the group. His eyes didn't miss even the smallest detail on the ground. A broken branch, a track left in mud, a faint scent carried by the wind. Today their target was a group of deer seen in pastures near the valley. This hunt was of vital importance for the clan's winter meat needs. The weather was clear, the ground suitable for hunting. Everything seemed as it should be. But after a while, Kyle hesitated. He raised his hand, signaling those behind him to be silent. Right next to the path where deer normally passed, there was something unusual. He bent to the ground and ran his fingers over an enormous track. This didn't belong to any animal he knew. It was as big as a mammoth track, but the shape was different. It resembled a human more. But no human could leave such a large track. The track was almost as long as his forearm and was deeply embedded in the soil. This showed that whatever left this track was not only large, but also incredibly heavy. The other hunters had also gathered around, looking at the track with silent anxiety. They had never seen anything like this in this region before. The old tales Gore told came to mind, but no one dared to voice it. Kale followed the direction of the track. The tracks went toward the thickest and darkest part of the forest. A few steps ahead was another oddity. The trunk of a young pine tree had been broken from far above a human's height, as if bent by a giant hand. No storm, no bear could break a tree this way. This was the work of an unimaginable force. The deer herd had completely left their minds. Their instincts told them they should return immediately. The atmosphere had changed. The familiar sounds of the forest, bird chirps, insect buzzes had ceased, replaced by a heavy and eerie silence. as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to pass. The hunters looked at each other. The expression in their eyes was the same: fear and astonishment. This was a situation that exceeded the rules of their world. They were the hunters of these lands, but now they felt they were in the domain of a hunter much larger than themselves. Cale gave the order to retreat. Without a single word, they began to silently return the way they came. Their steps were now more nervous, their glances more anxious. When they returned to the cave, no one cared about the failure of their hunt. Cale went to Gore, who was waiting at the cave entrance, and told him what they had seen. The expression on the old man's face didn't change, as if he had been expecting this news. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. "They've come," he whispered. "The tall ones have returned." These two words settled over the cave like a dark blanket. The valley's silence no longer brought peace. Instead, it was like a harbinger of a hidden threat. That evening, the silence around the fire was heavier than usual. The news the hunters brought had settled over the clan like a cloud of anxiety. Even the children felt the tension in the air, snuggling close to their mothers. Everyone's eyes were on Gore, sitting across the fire. The old man was the clan's living memory. His mind was filled with stories passed down through generations, with warnings and memories that must not be forgotten. He asked Cale to sit beside him and tell once more about the track and broken tree they had seen, this time so the entire clan could hear. As Cale spoke, the anxiety in faces deepened. Gore listened silently until Cale finished. Then, without taking his eyes from the fire's flames, he began to speak. His voice was like a whisper from the depths of a cave. Cracked and weary, but every word carried weight. "My father's father," he began, "saw them with his own eyes. In those days, our clan had newly come to this valley. The land was fertile, game was abundant, everything was fine. But then the forest's silence changed. Birds fell silent, animals disappeared. At night, they began to hear strange sounds from deep in the mountains, rumblings, as if the earth's heart was beating." Gore paused for a moment, as if he was reliving those memories in his own mind. "They called them the Tall Ones, because their height was close to the oldest pine trees. Their skin was hard and gray like rock. Their faces were expressionless, as if carved from stone. They didn't speak. They just moved silently like a shadow. But their steps made the earth tremble." Clan members listened with bated breath. They had heard this story in fragments before, but never connected to such a vivid, such a real threat. "They are hunters," Gore continued, "but not like us. They don't hunt for pleasure or hunger. For them, it's like a kind of ritual. They seek the strongest, the most intelligent, the most resilient. In those days, my grandfather and his friends, who were the clan's bravest hunters, decided to follow them to understand this new threat. They made a mistake. The tall ones always know when they're being watched." Gore's voice trembled. That night, 3 hunters disappeared from camp. Not a sound, not a scream, not a trace of struggle. They just vanished. The next day, the search party found only enormous footprints and their spears, carefully carved, left on the forest floor. This was the Tall One's message: "We see you. You are our prey." From that day on, our clan hid. They lived in caves, in hollows, in places the Tall Ones couldn't reach. After a while, the Tall Ones suddenly disappeared as they had come, but the fear always remained. My father used to say, "They are like the earth itself. Sometimes they sleep, but they never truly leave." Gore fell silent and let his eyes wander over the clan members. Now they're waking. The tracks Cale saw are their harbinger. The silent valley is no longer safe for us. We must hide and be silent, as our ancestors did. Because when a Tall One's eye turns upon you, there's nowhere left to run. Only the crackling of the fire could be heard. The story Gore told had transformed into a concrete fear. Now this wasn't just a track or a broken tree. This was the reawakening of a forgotten nightmare from generations past. Following the story Gore told, the clan's life changed overnight. The valley's peaceful silence had now taken on the tension of an eerie waiting. Everyone spoke more quietly. Children were strictly warned not to stray from the cave. Even the hunters no longer ventured into the forest with their former boldness. Now they set out in small groups, only for the most urgent needs, and always ready to return at any moment. The rhythm of daily life had been disrupted. When Alara went down to the riverbank to gather healing herbs, she no longer relaxed listening to bird songs. She constantly watched among the trees, over the hills. Every rustle of bushes, every sound of a breaking branch made her jump. She hurriedly filled her basket with the plants she gathered, wanting to return to the cave's safe environment as soon as possible. For Kale and the other hunters, the situation was even harder. After the failed deer hunt, the clan's food stocks were beginning to dwindle. They had to make a new hunting plan. But how? Going into the forest depths meant risking an encounter with the tall ones. They tried hunting in safer, more open areas, but the animals there were more skittish and harder to catch. One day, Kale and 2 other hunters set out to hunt mountain goats living around the steep cliffs surrounding the valley. This required a dangerous climb, but it seemed safer at least than the forest's blind spots. Their climb was exhausting, but successful. On a narrow path, they managed to corner a goat herd. Just as they had raised their spears, focused on their prey, a deep sound came from across the valley from inside the forest. This wasn't an animal sound. It resembled the sound of a tree falling, but much sharper and more powerful. Then another, as if a giant being was advancing, breaking trees like bushes. All the hunters froze. The goat herd, startled by the sound, immediately scattered and disappeared from sight. The hunting opportunity was lost, but no one cared. Their eyes were locked on the direction the sound came from. There, above the treetops, they saw a massive silhouette moving for just a moment. It was only an instant, like an optical illusion. But all 3 had seen the same thing. A shadow had moved above the forest, and then vanished. This was proof of how close the tall ones were. They were no longer just a track, a story. They were there, breathing inside the valley with them. The hunters returned to the cave with great disappointment and growing fear. Their empty hands were a harbinger of a problem greater than hunger. Fear was beginning to paralyze them. They couldn't hunt. They couldn't gather. The clan's life cycle had come to a standstill because of a threat whose existence wasn't even certain. That night, as Kale sat by the fire, he looked at the spear in his hand. This spear could take down a deer or a bison, but what could it do against a giant that broke trees like toys? For the first time, he felt not like a hunter but like prey, and this feeling shook the foundation of everything he knew. Days chased weeks. The clan tried to live within the narrow security circle they had established around the cave. Food stocks had dwindled dangerously. The young were restless, the elders anxious. Something had to be done. Tarak, one of the clan's young and brave hunters, said he could no longer endure this waiting. "We can't live in fear," he said one evening by the fire. "Is dying of hunger better than hiding from a shadow? The fish in the river are still there. Small animals are still in the forest. If we're careful, we can find food without being seen." Tarek's words made sense to some young hunters. Kale and Gore tried to warn him. "This isn't just a shadow, Tarek. This is a power we don't understand," Kale said. But Tarek's decision was firm. The next morning at dawn, Tarek and 2 young hunters who thought like him took their short spears and nets and set out toward the riverbank. As they left the cave, the rest of the clan watched them with silent anxiety. Hours passed. It became noon, then afternoon. As the sun began to set, the tension in the clan became palpable. Normally, such a simple task should have been finished long ago. Ilara came to Kale's side. There was an anxious expression on her face. "They should have returned," she whispered. Kyle said nothing. He just looked at the darkening silhouette of the forest. Just then, a scream came from inside the forest. But this wasn't a human scream of pain. It was more like a sound thrown with pure terror, suddenly cut off. Then came a deep echoing rumble, and then again that damning silence. Those in the cave froze. Kale and several hunters grabbed their spears without hesitation and began running toward where the sound came from. The air was about to darken and the forest interior was filled with shadows. When they approached the riverbank, the scene they saw froze their blood. At the river's edge, the 2 young hunters who were Tarek's friends were cowering on the ground in fear, trembling. Their eyes were wide open with terror. They couldn't utter a single word. All around were signs of struggle. Fish scattered on the ground, an overturned basket, and Tarek's broken spear. but there was no trace of Tarek. Kale asked the young hunters what happened. One of them could speak, stammering. It just came. There was no sound. A shadow appeared from among the trees. It grabbed Tarek, grabbed him like a piece of branch. In a single movement, then it was gone. The other hunter had his eyes fixed on the forest across the river. It had no face, he whispered. Just emptiness. And it was so tall. Tall as the sky. Kale looked at the ground. They were there. Those enormous human-like footprints he had seen before, this time much clearer and deeper. The tracks started from where Tarek was last seen and advanced straight into the forest depths, as if encountering no obstacles. Tarek was gone. He had left behind neither a blood trail nor a sign of struggle, as if he had been erased from the earth. The clan had suffered its first loss. The tall ones were no longer a story, a track, or a sound. They were a concrete nightmare that had torn away a part of the clan. That night no fire was lit in the cave. Everyone was left alone with their own fears in the darkness and silence. The loss of Tarek had cast an atmosphere of mourning over the clan. No one doubted the tall one's existence anymore. Fear had given way to deep grief and helplessness. Tarek's mother wept silently in the cave's darkest corner. No one dared to console her. The other two young hunters were still in shock. They couldn't shake the horrific scene they had witnessed from their minds, flinching at the slightest sound. The clan had faced many difficulties in its history. Harsh winters, famines, wild animal attacks. But this was different. This wasn't an enemy they could understand and fight. This was like a natural disaster. Unpredictable, irresistible, and merciless. For days, no one left the cave. They carefully shared the last remaining food. Meetings around the fire were no longer about hunting plans or tool-making. There was only one topic. What was to be done? Gore, with the wisdom his age gave him, said there was only one solution. "This valley is now cursed," he said in a low voice. "Our ancestors did the same thing. When the tall ones appeared, they left their lands. They sought a new home, a new beginning. We must go too." However, this decision wasn't as easy as it seemed. This valley was the only world they knew. Every path, every water source, every shelter was engraved in their memories. Their ancestors' graves were here. The cave where their children were born was here. Leaving this place meant leaving behind a part of their identity. Some objected. "Where will we go?" asked a young hunter. "We don't know what's out there. Perhaps even greater dangers await us. Here at least we have a place to hide." Kyle had been silent for days. He held himself responsible for Tarek's loss. He hadn't been able to stop him. Now the future of his clan rested on his shoulders. Everyone expected leadership from him. Finally, he stood up in the firelight and began to speak. His voice was resolute and clear. "Gore is right," he said. "Staying here means slowly being consumed. Fear has taken us captive. We can't hunt. We can't live. Every day passes waiting to see who the next loss will be. This is not a life." He let his eyes wander over the clan members. "Outside is uncertain, yes, but it also promises hope. There may be a place the tall ones can't reach. Higher mountains, narrower passes. We must find places where their size will be a disadvantage. If we stay here, our end is certain. If we go, we have a chance." Kale's words lit a small light of hope in the midst of hopelessness. The decision was made. The clan would leave this valley that had been their home for hundreds of years. Preparations began immediately. Dried meats, fruits, healing plants were stuffed into bags made of leather. Vital tools like spears, cutters, stone axes were carefully packed. Everyone took small items of personal and spiritual value. A seashell, an interestingly shaped stone, a bone fragment from their ancestors. A few days later, at dawn, the clan was ready. One last time they looked at their cave, at the pictures on the walls, at the earth where their ancestors slept. Then, in single file, they silently began to leave the valley. What they left behind wasn't just a cave, but also a life, memories, and a friend they had lost. Ahead of them stretched a long and dangerous road filled with unknowns. Migration was one of life's most fundamental and merciless realities. The clan had now set out like a tree uprooted, seeking new soil. The first days of the march passed with a sadness brought by moving away from the valley's familiar terrain and a tension created by the unknown. Children grew tired. The elderly had difficulty keeping up with the group's pace. Everyone spoke as little as possible, saving their energy for the arduous journey. Kale led the group from the front. His eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, trying to find the safest route. During the day, they preferred open terrains where the tall ones' massive bodies couldn't hide. At night, they sheltered in hollows under steep cliffs, in small caves or under thick trees. They avoided making fires. They feared that smoke and light might attract unwanted attention. So nights passed cold and dark. Alara was the clan's health officer. She prepared herbal poultices for those whose feet had blistered from walking, distributed energy-giving fruits to tired children. At the same time, she tried to keep the group's morale high. In the evenings, she whispered old stories to the children, tales of hero hunters and wise women. These stories were small lights of hope in the midst of darkness. The journey was taking them to lands they had never seen before. They crossed wide, windy plateaus, roaring rivers and canyons that seemed bottomless. Each new landscape was a source of both wonder and anxiety. They didn't know the rules of these lands. They had to learn through trial and error which animals were dangerous, which plants were poisonous. Once, while crossing what they thought was a shallow river, the strong current almost carried away old Gore. He was saved by Kale and the other hunters' timely intervention. This incident reminded them once again how vulnerable they were. Finding food was the biggest problem. Because they had to move quickly, they didn't have time to chase large prey. Their lives depended on fruits, roots they found along the way, small rodents and birds they caught. When hunger combined with exhaustion, it tested the clan's resilience. But these hardships bound them even closer to each other. Everyone helped each other, sharing their last bite without hesitation. They were a family, and in this journey, the only way to survive was to move together. At night, as Kale kept watch, he often observed the sky. The stars were the only unchanging thing he knew. Looking at them, he found his direction. Thinking that his ancestors had also walked under the same stars gave him strength. But sometimes he seemed to see a shadow moving above the mountain silhouette on the horizon. Perhaps it was just a dream, born of exhaustion. Perhaps not. The bad feeling inside him said they hadn't given up the chase. The tall ones might be moving slowly, but they were patient, and their steps were much larger than the clan's steps. This thought kept Kale from sleeping, pushing him to go faster, farther. After weeks of exhausting march, the clan's strength had reached the point of depletion. Just when hopelessness was beginning to show, what they were looking for appeared. At the foot of a high, steep mountain range stretched a narrow and sheltered valley. The valley's entrance was a narrow pass formed by two enormous rocks. This pass was so narrow that it seemed impossible for massive beings like the tall ones to pass through. Kyle and several hunters entered the valley for reconnaissance. The inside reminded them of the home they had left, but it was smaller and more sheltered. A clean stream flowed through the middle of the valley. Fruits were ripening in the surrounding trees. More importantly, they found a wide and dry cave on one of the valley's steep slopes. The cave's entrance was quite high from the ground and required climbing. This provided natural protection against both wild animals and other possible threats. This place was perfect, as if nature had gifted them this refuge. When the reconnaissance group gave the news to the rest of the clan, a smile appeared on weary faces that hadn't been seen in a long time. The clan settled into their new home. Their first task was to make a kind of ladder from logs and vines to make climbing to the cave entrance easier. Then they lit a new fire. The warmth and light of the flames warmed them not just physically but spiritually. For the first time in a long while, they felt somewhat safe. The new valley was generous to them. The stream was full of fish. The forest teemed with small game. Alara discovered new healing plants and edible roots she had never seen before. The clan's life slowly began to return to its old rhythm. Children's laughter echoed again in the cave walls. Hunters returned proudly after successful hunts. Now they could gather around the fire at night to tell stories, repair their tools. The memory of the tall ones remained in a corner of their minds like a nightmare. But they no longer had to be on guard at every moment. This narrow pass was their fortress. Every day, Kale checked the pass at the valley's entrance. He examined the soil, looking to see if there were any unusual tracks. There was nothing. Not a trace of giant footprints remained. Perhaps they had truly left them behind. Perhaps the tall ones hadn't dared to enter this steep and rugged terrain. This thought spread a feeling of relief through Kale. He had made the right decision for his clan. He had brought them to a safe place. However, Gore didn't share the same optimism. The old man spent his days sitting at the cave entrance, watching the mountains across. "What makes a trap safest is the comfort you feel when you enter it," he told Kale one day. "The tall ones don't hurry. They wait, watch. They look for your weakest moment. This valley's walls may protect us, but there are also places the walls can't see." Kyle understood the wisdom in the old man's words, but for now he didn't want to hear these warnings. His clan needed peace. For now, he wanted to enjoy this new refuge, bind wounds, and gather strength. They didn't know what the future would bring, but at least they had a present, and this was the most valuable thing they had possessed in a long time. Life in the new valley was like a kind of dream. Seasons changed, the clan grew stronger. There were new births. The clan's population slowly began to increase. Children knew the tall ones only as a fearful tale Gore told. For them, the threat was a wolf's howl that dared to approach the cave or the stream's cold waters. Kale, as the clan's leader, was respected. Thanks to his foresight, they had found this safe harbor. Hunts were bountiful. They were storing plenty of food for winter. The cave walls began to be decorated with pictures of new hunts and successes. Memories of the old valley slowly faded in minds. However, this peace was an illusion. One morning, Kale and a group of hunters were hunting mountain goats in a steep part of the valley they had never been to before, when they noticed something strange. On top of a high rock were a series of hollows. These weren't natural formations. Clearly, they had been carved into the rock as steps for climbing by someone, but the hollows were too large and too far apart for a human's steps, as if a giant being had climbed this steep cliff like a ladder. A coldness immediately gripped Kale's insides. These steps made the valley's narrow entrance completely meaningless. If the tall ones wanted, they could descend into the valley from above by crossing these high mountains. He understood then that they weren't safe at all. They were just inside a cage, and the hunter was waiting for the right moment to decide when to hunt them. Kyle kept this discovery secret from the clan. He didn't want to cause panic. What could they do anyway? Would they migrate again? Where to? This time they had nowhere to run. When he told Gore the situation, the old man wasn't surprised. He just nodded. "I told you," he said in a weary voice. "They are hunters, and a good hunter knows all of its prey's escape routes. They followed us here. They allowed us to find this place. They waited for us to think we were safe, to settle, to weaken. This is the truth." This reality pressed down on Kale's shoulders like a heavy burden. As the clan's leader, he thought he had brought them to safety. Instead, he had led them into a trap. Every day he began to watch the peaks of the mountains around the valley. Every moving shadow, every stone out of place caused his heart to beat faster. At night he couldn't sleep, waking at the slightest sound. While the other clan members enjoyed this peaceful life, Kale and Gore lived under the shadow of an invisible threat. This was worse than the fear in the old valley. There, at least they knew of their enemy's presence. They were on guard. The peace here was false. It was a lie. And Kale had to wait, not knowing when and how brutally this lie would end. Now when he looked at the valley, he didn't see a sheltered home but a hunting ground surrounded by high walls, and they were the prey. Though the illusion of peace had shattered in Kale and Gore's minds, for the rest of the clan, daily life continued. However, Kale's increasing tension and constant surveying of their surroundings began to catch the attention of others, especially Alara. One evening, Alara sat beside Kale and asked why he was so restless. Kale told her about the giant steps on the mountain. The smile on Alara's face slowly faded. Now she too knew the truth. Together they thought about what they could do without driving the clan into panic. The only thing that could be done was to observe and prepare. Kale decided to establish hidden watchtowers at the high points around the valley. These were simply rock crevices and tree hollows with wide views and easy concealment. Each day, different hunters began to keep watch at these points. Their task was to watch whether there was any movement on the mountain peaks. At first, the hunters found this task somewhat meaningless. Despite keeping watch for days, they saw nothing, but Cale was insistent. A few weeks later, one of the young hunters on watch came to the cave breathless. "I saw it," he said in a trembling voice. As the sun was setting, a silhouette above the highest peak. Just for a moment, but it was there. It was very large. This news had a shocking effect on the clan. There was no longer room for doubt. They were being watched. The tall ones were there, on the mountain peaks, patiently watching them. From that day on, the atmosphere in the valley completely changed. The false peace gave way to concrete fear. Children no longer played outside. Women went even to the stream's edge in groups. Everyone constantly looked at the mountain peaks, as if expecting a giant's head to appear at any moment. This situation began to wear down the clan's psychology. The constant feeling of being watched had destroyed the most basic sense of security. In their own home, in their own refuge, they were like prisoners. Cale knew this passive waiting would slowly consume them. They had to do something. They began defense preparations. At night, they pulled up the ladder that allowed climbing to the cave entrance. At the valley's narrow entrance, they built a primitive barricade of large rocks that could be toppled and sharpened logs. They knew these wouldn't stop a tall one, but they might at least slow them down. These preparations gave the clan a sense of purpose and a bit of control. They were no longer just passively waiting, they were actively trying to survive. However, when Cale looked at the mountains at night, he couldn't help thinking how futile these efforts were. It was like trying to stop a human by putting a twig at an ant nest's entrance. The watching eyes were observing their every move. They saw every defense plan, every preparation, as if they were playing a game with them, and only they knew the rules of this game. The clan continued to wait as the prey inside the trap, not knowing when the hunter's patience would run out. The waiting continued in a nerve-wracking silence. Every day was the same as the one before. Watchers kept guard. Clan members carried out their daily tasks under a veil of anxiety. There had been no sign of the tall ones for weeks. Some began to think that perhaps they had left, tired of waiting. But Cale and Gore knew this was the calm before the storm. The attack came at the most unexpected moment. It was a calm night when the full moon illuminated the sky with a silvery light. The only sound in the valley was the murmur of the stream and the chirping of night insects. Everyone in the cave was in deep sleep. Even the watchers had relaxed a bit after weeks of inactivity. It began first with a slight tremor in the ground. Most people didn't even feel it in their sleep, but Cale, who was on watch, felt it. He noticed the rock under his feet shake slightly. Immediately after, a crackling sound came from the barricade at the valley's entrance. As if a giant hand had broken the logs like matchsticks, Cale immediately sounded the alarm. His shout woke the cave from its sleep. Everyone jumped up in panic. While women pulled their children to themselves, men grabbed their spears. When they ran to the cave entrance, the scene they saw caused them to freeze. An enormous shadow was gliding through the valley's narrow entrance. Its silhouette was clearly visible in the moonlight. Its height nearly touched the cliffs on both sides of the valley. Its face couldn't be seen because it remained in shadow, but its body was solid and powerful like rock. It wasn't stepping. It was more like gliding. But every movement reflected absolute power and purpose. Clan members couldn't even make a sound from fear. The cave's high entrance gave them a momentary sense of security, but they knew how false this feeling was. The tall one wasn't even looking at the cave. Its eyes were locked on the area in the middle of the valley where the clan left bones from hunts and tools. It walked slowly there. It bent to the ground. With its enormous hand, it picked up a new spear Cale had made the day before. The spear looked like a toothpick in its hand. The tall one examined the spear for a moment, as if appreciating the craftsmanship. Then it broke it in two between two fingers with no effort whatsoever. With a snap, it threw the broken pieces to the ground. This was a clear message. Nothing you make has meaning. Your defense, your weapons, all are nothing before me. Then it turned back silently as it had come. It exited through the valley's entrance and disappeared into the night's darkness. It had left behind a broken spear and a clan in terror. This wasn't an attack. This was a show of force. It was a warning. The tall one had shown them that it could reach them whenever it wanted, however it wanted. The valley's walls, narrow passes, high caves, none of them had any meaning. Now the issue wasn't whether they would attack. The issue was when it would happen. That night no one could sleep until morning. Everyone waited for that enormous shadow to return from within the silence. The Tall One's night visit had destroyed even the clan's last crumbs of hope. Now they had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Their defenses were meaningless. It seemed they had no choice but to wait for what the next step would be. Despair spread over the clan like poison. People didn't talk to each other. Everyone had withdrawn into themselves. But Kale refused to accept this surrender. Yes, they were physically much weaker than them, but they had an advantage too: their intelligence and ability to act together. The Tall Ones seemed to hunt alone. The clan, however, was a whole. One night, Kale gathered the hunters he trusted most and Alara around the fire. "We can't wait," he said in a resolute voice. "If we wait, we'll be hunted one by one. Like Tarek, we must fight." The other hunters looked at him skeptically. "How will we fight, Kale?" said one of them. "What can we do against something that breaks a spear with its fingers?" "We can't fight directly," Kyle replied, "but a trap can take down even the greatest hunter. We must use their strength and size against them." A plan was beginning to take shape in Kale's mind. Desperate, perhaps even suicidal, but better than nothing. The plan was based on using the valley's geographical structure. In one part of the valley, there was a steep cliff above the stream bed. The cliff's edge was filled with large and precariously balanced rocks. Kale's plan was to lure the Tall One under this cliff and then topple the rocks above onto it. This required incredible coordination and courage. First, bait was needed to lure the Tall One there. Kale took this task upon himself. He had to provoke it enough to draw its attention, to force it to chase, but be fast enough not to get caught. Second, the rest of the hunters had to hide at the top of the cliff behind the rocks. At the right moment, using the logs and levers in their hands, they had to dislodge the giant rocks. A single mistake could cost Kale his life, and whether the trap would even work wasn't certain. Perhaps the rocks would only wound the Tall One and make it even angrier. The plan carried great risk, but at the same time it offered a glimmer of hope. Instead of just waiting to be victims, it gave them a chance to take control of their own fate. The hunters discussed the plan at length. They were afraid, but Kale's determination was contagious. What did they have left to lose anyway? In the end, they all agreed. Preparations began in great secrecy. At night, when moonlight was at its minimum, the hunters climbed to the top of the cliff and began to hollow out beneath the rocks, making them more unstable. Alara and the other women prepared distracting objects Kale would use while provoking the Tall One. Bright stones tied to animal bones that made sounds in the wind. The plan was slowly taking shape. This wasn't a hunting plan. This was a rebellion. It was tiny beings rising up against the giant hunting them. Their chance of success was very low, but this was their chance to fight for an honorable end. The day the plan would be implemented had arrived. The weather was overcast and oppressive. The sky was covered with leaden clouds, as if nature itself was holding its breath with the tension of what was to come. Kale bid farewell to clan members one by one. No one was speaking, but their eyes said everything. Alara pressed an eagle feather into Kale's hand, which they believed would bring luck. Little Lynn clung to his father's leg. Kale stroked his son's hair. He tried to give him a smile but couldn't. This might be their last meeting. The hunters silently took their places at the top of the cliff as planned. Those remaining in the cave, under Alara and Gore's leadership, fell into silent waiting. Now everything depended on Kale. Kale took a deep breath and began to walk alone toward the valley's entrance. His purpose was to provoke the Tall One. He exited the valley and began shouting toward the mountain foothills. He was crying out his ancestors' war cries, waving the spear in his hand in the air. He was challenging. Hours passed. There was no movement. Kyle was beginning to lose hope. Perhaps the Tall One wasn't there. Perhaps it had left. Just when he was thinking of turning back, he noticed movement on one of the mountain slopes, among the trees. It was there. The giant silhouette was watching him from behind the rocks. His heart felt like it wouldn't fit in his chest, but he suppressed his fear. He began to make more noise, shaking the bright stones and bones in his hand. He had caught the tall one's interest. The giant being slowly emerged from where it was hiding and began to advance toward Kale. It was much faster than Kale expected. Each of its steps was like an earthquake shaking the earth. Without a moment's hesitation, Kale turned his back and began running toward the valley. The most dangerous part of the plan had begun. He had to stay ahead of the tall one but not get caught. As he ran, he looked back from time to time. The tall one was following him. It didn't look angry or hurried. It was just methodically tracking its prey. This was less like a chase and more like a walk toward an inevitable end. Kale passed through the valley's narrow entrance and continued running toward the cliff where the trap was set. His lungs were burning. His legs felt like they couldn't carry him, but he couldn't stop. He might not feel the giant's breath on his neck behind him, but the crushing pressure created by its presence was more frightening than anything. When he reached the bottom of the cliff, as they had planned, he hesitated for a moment and looked up at where the hunters were hiding. This was the signal. Then, with one last effort, he threw himself to the side and hid behind a rock. The tall one, following Kale, stopped right in the middle of the trap. It looked up in the direction Kale had looked. At that moment, for an instant, Kale saw its face. It wasn't as Gore had described, not empty or expressionless. On its face was almost a curiosity, an effort to understand, as if it was trying to comprehend these tiny beings' audacious plan. But that moment was very brief. With Kale's signal, hell broke loose at the top of the cliff. The hidden hunters began to push the logs in their hands with all their strength. The enormous rocks they had prepared for weeks, whose balance they had disrupted, first resisted with a creak. Then they slowly began to tilt. The tall one had heard the sounds from above, had sensed the danger, but it was too late to move. The first rock slid down with a terrible rumble. The stone weighing tons struck the tall one's shoulder. The giant roared not with pain but with surprise. Its voice echoed in the valley like a storm. This was the first sound they had heard from a tall one, deep, guttural, and otherworldly. The first rock was followed by others. The hunters, setting aside their fears, worked like ants, pushing rocks down the cliff one after another. A rock avalanche had begun. Tons of stone, dust, and earth were raining down on the tall one. The giant tried to protect its head with its arms, but it couldn't resist against the crushing force of the rocks. One rock hit its leg, and the tall one collapsed to its knees. Another hit its back, forcing it to lean forward. From behind the rock where he was hiding, Kale watched what was happening in terror. Their plan had worked. Unbelievable, but it had worked. The tall one had been buried under the rocks. When the dust cloud dispersed, the scene was horrific. The tall one was almost completely buried under a massive pile of stones. Only one arm and part of its head were outside. It wasn't moving. There was absolute silence in the valley. The hunters above held their breath, trying to understand if the victory was real. Slowly they emerged from where they were hiding. Kale also left his shelter and with cautious steps approached the pile of stones. The other hunters also descended from the cliff and gathered beside him. They looked at the tall one's arm that remained outside. Its skin was gray and cracked like a rock. But from somewhere, a dark, almost black liquid was seeping. It was the tall one's blood. They had wounded it. Perhaps they had even killed it. One of the hunters was about to let out a victory cry when Gore's voice stopped them. The old man was beside them, though they didn't know when he had arrived. "Don't rejoice," he said in a trembling voice. "Not yet." Just then, movement came from under the pile of stones. The tall one's hand that remained outside slowly clenched. It wasn't dead. And Kale saw an expression in the tall one's half-open eye. This expression wasn't pain or anger. It was more a kind of recognition, as if it had truly seen them for the first time. They were no longer just running, hiding little creatures. They were beings that fought back, that fought, and that hurt. A rumble came from deep under the pile of stones. Then, with incredible force, the tall one's body shook. The rocks on top of it began to tremble. It was alive and trying to free itself. The reality that the tall one was still alive instantly destroyed the hunters' drunken victory. In panic, they didn't know what to do. Kyle immediately pulled himself together. "Scatter! Retreat!" he shouted. The hunters, obeying his command, began running back toward the cave. Kale looked back one last time. The tall one, with an incredible force of will, was moving the stones on top of it. It might be wounded and trapped, but it was still unimaginably powerful. The clan took refuge in the cave. Everyone waited in fear for the Tall One to free itself from the wreckage and come for revenge. Hours passed. Rumbles and growls caused by the Tall One's efforts came from outside, but no one came to the cave. As evening fell, the sounds gradually ceased. Kale and the two bravest hunters, succumbing to their curiosity, decided to go back to the bottom of the cliff. The scene they saw was surprising. The Tall One was gone. It had somehow managed to scatter the pile of stones on top of it and free itself. On the ground was a pit left by its massive body, and black bloodstains scattered around, and also tracks left by a limping giant going in the direction it came. It must have been severely wounded in one leg. It had retreated. They had defeated it, at least for now. When they returned to the cave and gave the news, the clan experienced cautious joy. They had survived. They had accomplished the impossible and repelled a Tall One. That night, for the first time in a long while, a celebration was held in the cave. They danced around the fire. They sang victory songs. This wasn't just a military victory, it was also a psychological one. They were no longer victims, they were warriors. However, this victory had a price. The next day, when they checked the cliff where they had set the trap, they faced a bitter reality. Two of the hunters who had toppled the rocks had lost their balance during the sliding of the stones and fallen from the cliff. Their bodies lay lifeless a little distance from where the Tall One had fought. Another hunter had broken his arm while pushing a log with a rock and could no longer hunt. They had suffered 3 losses. Their victory was a Pyrrhic victory. The cost had been heavy. Moreover, Gore's warning didn't leave their minds. "You wounded one," the old man had said in the middle of the celebrations. "But you didn't exterminate the species. They don't speak, but they communicate. We're no longer simple prey. Now in their eyes we're a threat, and a threat isn't ignored. It's eliminated." These words cast a shadow over the joy brought by victory. Yes, they had won a battle, but perhaps they had unknowingly started a much larger war. What would the wounded Tall One tell its clan? When it said what these small, audacious creatures could do, what would the others do? They tried to continue their lives in the valley, but nothing was the same as before. Everyone knew this was just a beginning. Beyond the mountains, a wounded giant's anger, and perhaps the curiosity of others, was growing. Silence had returned, but this wasn't a silence of peace brought by victory. It was the eerie silence before a bigger storm would break. The weeks and months following the victory passed in uncertainty. There was no news of the Tall Ones. The mountain peaks were silent, the valley's entrance calm. However, this silence was more frightening than before. Before, they were living in fear of an unknown threat. Now they knew what they were facing, and they knew that their enemy also knew them. This knowledge poisoned every moment. The clan tried to bind its wounds. Mourning was held for the 2 hunters who lost their lives at the cliff. The task of the hunter whose arm was broken was changed to tool making and teaching hunting techniques to children. Life had to go on somehow. But over everything was that heavy waiting. The watchers kept their watch with much greater seriousness than before. At the slightest suspicion, they gave the alarm, driving the clan into unnecessary panic. Night sleeps were broken. People had become startled at the slightest sound. This psychological war was more wearing than physical war. Kale blamed himself. He had thought that by setting the trap he had saved his clan, but now he was sure he had thrown them into greater danger. He had lost 2 friends, and now his entire clan faced a greater threat because of his decision. This burden grew heavier on his shoulders with each passing day. At night he would sit at the cave entrance watching the dark mountains, trying to guess what the next move would be. Alara was his greatest supporter. "You did what was right, Kale," she would tell him. "You gave us a chance. If we had waited, we wouldn't have even had that chance. Together, we'll face whatever comes." Disagreements began to emerge within the clan as well. Some were questioning Kale's leadership, saying they were suffering the Tall One's wrath because of him. These people suggested leaving the valley and going even farther, into the unknown. Others were in favor of staying and fighting. This valley was now their home, and they were ready to die to defend it. This internal tension threatened the clan's unity. Gore watched these arguments silently. One day he spoke to the clan gathered by the fire. "Leaving or staying won't change anything," he said wisely. "For the tall ones, the world is small. They'll find us wherever we are. The problem isn't where we are, but what we are. We were prey for them. Now we're rivals. And they don't like competition. We have only one way: to be smarter, to be more prepared." Gore's words calmed the arguments for a while. The clan understood that their fate was shared. They decided to stay together and prepare for what was to come. They strengthened their cave even more. They designed new traps. They began to make plans not just for defense, but also for offense. Now they had to account for perhaps not just one tall one, but more. Instead of being crushed under the weight of waiting, they decided to use this time to grow stronger. But the question in everyone's mind was the same. How much time did they have left, and how destructive would the next encounter be? The mountains continued to keep the answer to these questions as a secret. Seasons turned. Another winter passed. Spring came. The clan had almost gotten used to the tension brought by waiting. They had completed their preparations. They were on alert at every moment against a possible attack, but nothing was happening. Hope was beginning to sprout again. Perhaps the tall one they had wounded was alone. Perhaps it had left in fear. This fragile hope was shattered one afternoon. One of the watchers reported seeing not one, but 3 enormous silhouettes descending from the mountain peaks toward the valley. Panic spread like a forest fire. This was the moment they had been waiting for, but it was much worse than they expected. 3 tall ones. Kale immediately assembled the war council. Their plans were for 1 tall one, not for 3. The cliff trap wouldn't work a second time. They knew it now. Closing themselves in the cave and defending meant dying of hunger under siege. Options were exhausted. For the first time in his life, Gore spoke with an expression of helplessness on his face. "The end has come," he whispered. "The spirits of our ancestors are ready to call us to their side." But Kale didn't give up. "No," he said in a harsh voice. "The end comes when we decide. We'll meet them here, on our own ground, by our own rules." A new plan took shape in minutes in the midst of desperation and adrenaline. They would divide the clan in 2. Alara, Gore, the children, and the elderly would hide in the cave's deepest and narrowest passages. The entrance to these passages was too narrow for a tall one to fit through. Kale and all the remaining warriors would stay in the valley and keep the tall ones occupied, if possible drawing them in different directions to divide their forces. This was a suicide mission. Everyone was aware of this. The aim wasn't to win, but to buy time for those in the cave. Alara vehemently opposed this plan. She didn't want to leave Kale, but Kale was resolute. "You must keep them alive, Alara. The future of our clan is in your hands. You must pass on our stories, our knowledge to Lynn and the others, so we won't be forgotten." They bid farewell in tears. The clan split in 2. While one group took refuge in the cave's dark womb, the other group began to wait for their fate in the valley's open grave. Soon, 3 shadows appeared at the valley's entrance. One of them walked slightly differently from the others. It was limping. This was the tall one they had wounded. The other 2 it had brought with it seemed larger and more imposing than it. They had come for revenge. The tall ones spread out in the valley. They weren't speaking, but their movements were completely coordinated. One controlled the stream bed, one the forested area, and the wounded one the path leading directly to the cave. Kale and his warriors watched from behind the rocks and trees where they were hiding this terrible moment when prey had turned into hunter. Kale gripped the spear in his hand. This was the final battle. He was ready to sacrifice his own life for his clan's survival. He took a deep breath and once again shouted his ancestors' war cry. This was the signal for the battle's beginning. With Kale's cry, the valley turned into a battlefield. Warriors burst from where they were hiding and attacked the tall ones. Their plan wasn't to target them directly, but to constantly move, distracting their attention and separating them from each other. They were small, fast, and unpredictable. One group of warriors circled around the tall one in the stream bed, throwing spears at its legs. Though the spears didn't pierce the rock-like skin, they were annoying needles that distracted it. Another group harassed the tall one in the forested area with resin-coated branches set on fire. They tried to trap it among the trees. Kale had taken on the most dangerous task. He was facing the wounded tall one. This tall one was different from the others. There was anger in its movements, a thirst for revenge. It had personally targeted Kale. Kale was dodging the giant's blows with incredible agility. While the tall one's massive foot pulverized a rock, Kale had already leaped to another place. His aim was to keep it away from the cave entrance. The battle had turned into complete chaos. The courage and coordination of the Neanderthal warriors had surprised the tall ones for a moment. These tiny beings, instead of running away in fear, were attacking in an organized manner. However, the power imbalance was mercilessly obvious. The tall one in the stream bed finally got angry, and with a sweep of its enormous arm, flung 3 of the warriors circling around it to the side at once. The warriors struck the rocks like lifeless dolls. The tall one in the forest, to get free from the burning branches, uprooted several trees and threw them aside, clearing its way. The battle was turning against the Neanderthals. Every lost warrior further diminished their forces. Kale saw the situation was hopeless, but didn't give up. He focused on the wounded tall one's limping leg. If he could wound it once more in the same place, perhaps there might be a chance. With a risky move, he dove between the giant's feet, and with all his strength, drove his sharpest spear into where the tall one's old wound was. This time, the tall one truly roared in pain. Its voice shook the mountains. In anger, it turned to Kale. But Kale had already moved away. However, this move had exhausted all of Kale's energy. For a moment, he staggered. That brief moment was enough for the tall one. The giant grabbed Kale like a rag and lifted him into the air. Kale was struggling helplessly in the giant's palm, meters above the ground. The tall one brought him to the level of its face. Kale looked at that expressionless face carved from stone, but this time he saw something in its eyes. A kind of respect, or perhaps just a hunter's appreciation of a brave prey. Kyle knew his end had come. He closed his eyes and thought of Alara and Lynn, but the crushing end he expected didn't come. Instead, along with the tall one's roar, a sound came from deep within the cave. The other warriors, seeing their leader had been captured, had attacked the tall ones one last time with desperate fury. The wounded tall one, angered by this distracting attack, flung Kale to the side. Kale fell hard to the ground. Before he lost consciousness, the last thing he saw was the other 2 tall ones one by one, mercilessly destroying the last remaining warriors. The final resistance had ended. Years melted away in the cave's timeless darkness. That small group of survivors slowly dwindled. One day, Gore silently fell asleep and never woke again. The other wounded followed him. In the end, only 3 people remained. An aged and limping Kyle, Alara with white streaks in her hair, and Lynn, now a young man. They were completely cut off from the outside world. They hadn't seen the tall ones since the last battle. Perhaps they hoped they had forgotten them, thought their line had ended, but fear kept them bound to the cave. One day, Kyle realized he could no longer endure. "I must see the sky one more time," he told Alara. "I must show Lynn that the world I told him about is real." Alara was afraid, but she saw the longing in Kale's eyes. Together they proceeded through passages they hadn't walked in years toward the cave entrance. Daylight hurt their eyes. When they slowly adjusted to the light, they looked at the landscape outside. The valley had changed. The forest had thickened even more. The stream bed had changed direction. But the biggest change was what stood in the middle of the valley. There stood a massive, crudely made monument of stone. There was no carving on it, no writing. Just a giant stone erected where their last stand had taken place. This was the work of the tall ones. But why? Was it a victory monument or a gravestone? Perhaps in that final battle, they had respected them. They had erected a kind of monument to their courage, their resistance. This thought lightened a bit the burden of defeat Kale had carried for years. Perhaps they hadn't been completely destroyed. Perhaps they lived on in their enemies' minds as a respected memory. Kale turned to Lynn. "Did you see?" he said. "This was our home. Under that stone lie heroes you never knew but whose blood you carry. Their stories now live on in you." Lynn looked at the monument silently. He was a person of a new world, born in the cave, raised on stories. But now he was seeing concrete proof of those stories. He was the end of the Neanderthal clan, but at the same time, he was their immortality. Kale, Alara, and Lynn stood at the cave entrance watching the setting sun. The world no longer belonged to them. It had new owners, but they had existed. They had fought, loved, lost, and remembered. And now, as a whisper, an echo in the minds of their last representatives, they continued to live. The winds of time would erase their names, their cave would fill with earth, their bones would turn to dust. But the story of these brave people who once lived in the shadow of giants would continue to whisper forever in the silence of the universe. When Cale regained consciousness, everything around was pitch black. Every part of his body hurt. He tried to slowly sit up, but sharp pain stopped him. His leg was broken. As he tried to crawl forward, a hand touched his shoulder. He flinched in fear, but then he heard the whisper. "Kyle." It was Alara's voice. They were in the depths of the cave. After the battle ended, Alara and a few people had waited for the Tall Ones to leave. Then they had gone outside and carried Kyle and a few others surviving wounded inside. In the valley outside, there was no trace of the clan's warriors. The Tall Ones had even taken their dead. Only silence and the heavy scent of defeat remained. The survivors didn't exceed the fingers of one hand. Kyle, Alara, Lynn, and a few more children. Gore and a few wounded people. Nearly the entire clan had been destroyed. They couldn't even be counted as a clan anymore. They were just a handful of refugees. They began to spend their days in the cave's narrowest and darkest passage. They were afraid to go outside. They were worried the Tall Ones would return and finish the job. Their food consisted of only the small amount of dried meat and fruits they had been able to take with them. Their water was from drops seeping from the walls. This wasn't a life, it was a waiting. They lost their sense of time. They didn't know whether it was day or night. Their only light source was the flickering and sooty flame they obtained by burning animal fat they smeared on moss. In this dim light, Gore continued to tell them old stories. But these weren't stories of heroism and victory anymore. These were stories of loss, of survival, and of remembering. "Our bodies may perish," Gore's whisper would say in the darkness. "But as long as our stories live, so do we. Lynn, you must listen. You must keep everything in your mind. Cale's courage, the warrior's sacrifice, how strong this clan once was. You will be our living memory." As Cale lay with his broken leg in the darkness, he listened to Gore. He had failed as a leader. He hadn't been able to protect his clan, but he found consolation in Gore's words. Perhaps leadership wasn't just about winning battles. Perhaps true leadership was ensuring memories were passed on to the next generation. From that day on, Cale began to tell Lynn everything he knew. How to make tools, which tracks belonged to which animals, how to find direction by looking at the stars. Though they couldn't physically go anywhere, mentally he was raising him as a hunter, as a leader. The cave's darkness had become their new world. The valley outside, the mountains, the sky no longer belonged to them. That world was now the Tall Ones' world. They had become a memory beneath the earth. A memory that resisted being forgotten, living on in whispers. And thus the silent farewell of a species is lost in the depths of time. This is not a story of victory or defeat. It is a reflection of existence in its purest form. The struggle of the Neanderthals living in the shadow of giants tells how valuable intelligence, courage, and most importantly memory are against great powers. They may have perished physically, but their memories, their stories, and that fragile legacy they passed on to the last representative of their line are the most enduring proof of their existence. The world changes, species come and go, but the desire to survive and be remembered is as old as life itself.